Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another lecture put on by the Center for Study of Government in the Individual, or CSGI. We're very excited today to have a speaker that I'm going to let my colleague Anna Faria introduce. But this is part of our speaker series, which exists to study the constitutional, economic, and political foundations of a free and flourishing society. As part of that mission, we regularly host lectures just like this. We look at enduring principles of the Constitution, we look at the background institutions necessary for a free society, and I think that this talk will be very much in that vein today. And we also, on other occasions, deal with problems in contemporary public policy. So this is another one of our events. Thank you for coming. You can see our website up here. Be free to visit it. It's CSGI.co. And if you'd like to get on the mailing list, please do so if you are not already. I'd also like to thank all of CSGI's sponsors for making events like this possible. But then I'm going to turn over the mic to a colleague of mine who I'd like to introduce. Anna Faria, who maybe perhaps some of you have seen around campus, is an assistant professor of economics here at UCCS, and she's also an affiliate scholar at CSGI. Her research focuses on a variety of issues, from the relationship of millennial generation in socialism to the economic history of immigration education and authoritarianism in Brazil. She's actually currently working on a booklet for CSGI that looks at the expansion of government in the U.S. She earned her PhD in economics from George Mason University in 2017 before joining UCCS the same year. Also, I just wanted to recognize one feather in her cap. In 2019, she was awarded the Teacher of the Year for LAS, for the whole College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, which is quite a good award there. So we're very, very happy to have her as part of CSGI, and she was the one who organized this talk and will be moderating it for you today. So with that, I turn it over to Anna Faria.
Thank you, Steve. Welcome, everyone. One thing, Steve, I'll mention is if you are here for an econ class, please sign in at the end of the event. It's over here on the side. We just want to make sure that you know where to go once we've wrapped up. But today it is my honor to welcome Vernon Smith to the UCCS campus. This is a unique opportunity for us. I'll keep his introduction very short, though his list of accomplishments is anything but. Vernon is the George Argyros Endowed Chair in Finance and Economics and Professor of Economics and Law at Chapman University in California. In 2002, he was awarded the highest prize in economics, the Nobel Prize in Economic Science, for his work on experimental economics. He's the author of hundreds of academic and non-academic articles, as well as many books. His CV is 48 pages long, so I'll leave it at that. I will say that Vernon is also now a resident of Colorado Springs, so it is a particular pleasure to bring him to our campus. I had my first opportunity to interact with Vernon and his work as an undergraduate student at James Madison University about 15 years ago, when he visited our campus to talk about something very different than what we're going to see today. Still, it was an amazing experience. I then had the double fortune of meeting him again as a graduate student at George Mason University, where he was no longer teaching at the time, though he did from 2001 to 2008 before he went to Chapman. While he was no longer a faculty member at George Mason, his influence was very clear at the campus, and most importantly, very strong on my education and on the education of my peers. So to some of you here who are my students, this is a particular pleasure to have you participate in what I have as well. But there is also another thinker by the name of Smith, Adam Smith, who influenced me and many others deeply. And today we have the opportunity to bring them together on our campus, where Vernon is going to talk about Adam Smith's theory of society. So without further ado, please welcome Vernon Smith.
Well, thank you, Anna.
Perfect.
It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to talk about my favorite modern author, Adam Smith. He wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759, but he is still fresh and relevant for today. And I hope to be able to convey some notion of how fresh and relevant he is for today. He wrote, essentially, I see the theory of moral sentiments as Adam Smith's articulation of a theory of society. He followed that with The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and that extended those concepts to economics, to economy, and to the operation of economy and for human action in economics. He makes, I want to begin with a couple of methodological distinctions that Adam Smith makes that we don't do today, and that is in a way what makes him so fresh and relevant. Firstly, he distinguished between being self-interested and acting in your self-interest. See, we don't do that today. If you are self-interested, then you act in your self-interest. He made that distinction. And that's the source, I think, of a lot of his insight. He also distinguished between the origins of action and the consequences of action. And we tend to, utilitarian analysis tends to bring these together. You act because of the consequences, and they lead to good outcomes or bad outcomes. But so that's and I think this will come out, that distinction, as I go through some of what Adam Smith talks about. I want to begin with what he said about how he introduced the notion that we are all social and inevitably social. He said, imagine that a member of the species is brought up entirely isolated from all other members of the species, that we are an individual, a human individual is brought up in that way. He said that person can no more know what it means for his mind to be deformed than for his face to be deformed. He says, bring him into society and you give him the mirror he wanted before, the mirror that he was lacking to see. So Smith sees us all as social, and we start to learn that to become social very early. He says that at the first stage, we imagine what another person must feel given the situation he is in, because we remember being in that situation and what we felt and how we acted. He says that's the way we, in our imagination, we can never know for certain what another person feels, but this is the way you see that we approximate that and make a judgment about what another person must feel. Then, he said, we become aware that other people are evaluating and judging us in the same way. They're making judgments about us based upon our situation and events and the actions we take. And then at the third stage, we start to take into account in our actions what other people how other people may see us. So we come to see us ourselves as others see us, and then we use that starts to modify how we act and behave. So I see that as kind of the three-step process, as that's the way Smith would describe our becoming social. And of course this begins in our family, but Smith thought it really began in earnest when we first had playfellows. He said when we first had playfellows, and he says that's about the time we start to school. It was in his day. Of course, we now have preschool, so it may start sooner. But he says our playfellows are not as indulgent as our parents in accepting our actions when they don't like them. And they let us know when they disagree with the actions. If we show our anger or displeasure and everything, our playfellows let us know that they don't like that. So we start to learn what others, people that are beyond our family, how they are reacting to the actions that we take. And this then accounts for our tendency to become rule creators and rule followers, not as individuals, but in our interactions with others. And Smith argued that there are just two pillars of societies, and these are two classes of rules that we follow. The first come under the heading of beneficence, and the second under the heading of justice. So let me give you his first proposition on beneficence. He doesn't call it that. But whenever Adam Smith makes a propositional statement, and it may be in a sentence or two, read it again. He is stating a proposition that will be predictive. And in fact, Bart Wilson and I see you've got our book here on humanomics. Bart Wilson and I have used the theory of moral sentiments to design two-person experiments in the laboratory. And because these propositions are quite rich and they're predictive. And by the way, he's got a very good batting average, you see, 280 years after he wrote these propositions. But here is what I would call beneficence proposition 1. Smith says that actions of a beneficent tendency, which are properly motivated, alone require reward because of the gratitude felt by the observer, the recipient of the action, but also third-party observers, because these rules don't come just from bilateral action, they come from the community, observers, seeing others. So now let me give you an example of this. And this is what I call this the parable of the trash barrel. It's Monday morning, and you're heading off to work. And it's also trash pickup day. So before you leave your house, you get your trash barrel out from behind the garage and take it out to the curbside to be picked up. All right, you come home that evening, your thoughts are on the day's events, and you forget to bring in your trash barrel. Your neighbor is out bringing in her trash barrel, and she notices that you didn't bring it in. So she brings it in for you. Now that's important, because early Tuesday morning, the street sweeper comes through, and if you've left your trash barrel out, you're in danger of getting a citation. So, that's on Monday. The following Saturday, you're out picking avocados off of your 2 avocado trees in the backyard, and you have an extra sack and you fill it with avocados for your neighbor. You take it over to give the avocados to her, and she's not home, so you leave it on the doorstep. She'll know where it came from. Now notice all the information that's in this neighborhood. Well, we often, Hyde has spoken very eloquently in his AER 1945 paper, talks about the markets as information systems, prices as conveying information. Information is widely distributed in markets, and people are acting on buying and selling, making just purchase and sale decisions, and prices formulate, come out of that, and those prices are carriers of information. Well, but notice here, we're talking about an exchange system in a local neighborhood and community, and there's a lot of information there. For one thing, my neighbor likes avocados. Not everybody does. My kids don't like them. I like them and she likes them. So I wouldn't give her avocados if I didn't know that she liked them. Also, notice in this parable, I started with Monday, and she brings in my trash barrel. The following Saturday, I give her some avocados. I could have given her the avocados of Saturday before the Monday. You see, order of moves here is not that important. Just people do good things for each other. And beneficence is about, and Smith's propositions on beneficence are about the good things we do for each other in our day-to-day interactions. The obverse of that proposition on beneficence is his proposition on justice. And that proposition says that actions of a hurtful tendency that are improperly motivated deserve punishment because of the resentment felt by the person who is hurt by this. Resentment, Smith says, is a very automatic, almost immediate response in our feelings. He said we want to, and we want to punish the perpetrator of a hurtful action so that that person will feel, you see, the consequences that others suffer as a result of the actions that person takes. And he goes on to say that what's the most hurtful action that anyone can take toward another human being? He says it's to kill them. And next most hurtful actions are things like theft and robbery. And then finally, actions like violation of contract. And he says to kill someone because it's the most hurtful action, it has the greatest punishment. And in most modern nations, of course, we have capital punishment for murders. There's lots of degrees of variation, but capital punishment is among them. He says in the history of the development and growth of governments, he said it wasn't always so. He said when governments are weak and decentralized, the authorities are very concerned to follow the rules of the community over which they have some exercise, some power and control. And often in early governments were formed when at a time when there were very powerful families. And he points out in that situation, and so if your son kills my son, and the authorities apprehend your son, they bring him to me, the head of the family. And the family may get together. And we decide what's to be done. And it wouldn't necessarily mean that your son would be put down at all. In fact, there's a good chance that an arrangement would be made where there would be a transfer of assets or wealth, or a period of where your son would work for my family. In other words, the punishment of the perpetrator of the crime would involve compensation of the victim. And you see, in modern states, we've lost that. You see, now, if you commit a murder, that's a public crime, and it's a crime against the public, and it could involve the death penalty. And then he says there's theft. Think of that as a property right. If there's control of murder, that means in that world you have rights to your own body. You have property in your own body if you live in a society which protects you from murder. All right, theft and robbery is controlled by, there's punishments for that, and these are intended as deterrents of theft and robbery, and that gives individuals property in the products of their body. And then, since violation of contract it also has penalties. This is violation of contract is not a criminal offense, so it's a civil offense. And it's interesting, you see that in modern society that involves compensation of the victim. So if you violate a contract, and then there's you compensate the person who was hurt by that by an amount that that's intended to make that person whole, restore the person. So, and Smith points out that he raises the question, why is the penalty greater for theft and robbery than a violation of contract? He says it's because theft and robbery dispossesses us of things of value that we have already acquired. There's a modern literature, you know, on the asymmetry between gains and losses, and the downside is much more serious than the upside. There's some huge literature, empirical literature. Smith states very clearly propositions on the asymmetry between, he says, between joy and sorrow. The asymmetry between gains and losses comes more fundamentally from an asymmetry between our joy and our sorrow. And anyone, he says, that's reasonably well situated has far more potentially that person can lose than he can gain. So the downside, so that that asymmetry between joy and sorrow, between gain and loss, affects very much our relationships with others. And he's also using it here to explain why society, why a $5,000 theft is more serious than a $5,000 violation of contract. Because it takes from us what we have already acquired. Violation of contract simply frustrates our expectation of gain, but we don't, it's not here yet. And in fact, things might happen that I wouldn't get the gain anyway in the contract. So there's a lot of reasons for that you might distinguish between property that's already in your possession and property or good things that might be. Well, this I think is the I'm giving you here in this summary. Smith's propositions on the basic ones on beneficence and justice. Justice, to me, in reading the theory, he doesn't say this, but I see his theory of justice as underlying a theory of property involving persons, things, as well as violation of contract. When he came to write the theory of moral sentiment, the wealth of nations, he speaks then of property as being important, as it's a necessary condition for the performance of a free economy. That people not be involuntarily dispossessed of things that they produce, create, and make. All right, and then I might give you let me give you another proposition in Smith, and and this is just kind of food for thought. These propositions on beneficence and justice we've used to study trust games in the lab. And in a trust game is just a two-person game in which say the first person can opt out and you each get $10, or the first person can pass play to person 2, the $20 is doubled to $40, and that's because we think of there being some synergy between 2 individuals. So person 1 passes to 2. Actively, the stakes double. Person 2 can give $15 to person 1 and take 25. That's play right, or you can play down and take all the money. We first started doing these games about 1989, 90. And we were astonished because people in the lab, and we're paying real cash, about half or a little more of person 1s were passed to person 2. And of course, the analysis of the game says you shouldn't do that because the guy will take all the money, see? Well, a little over half were doing it. And the second movers, 2/3 of them were cooperating, paying, choosing the 15-25 outcome. And 1/3 defecting, taking all the money. So we found that hard to explain. But think about Smith's beneficence proposition 1. Actions of a beneficent tendency that are properly motivated alone to sort of reward because of the gratitude felt. Smith is, so person 2, there's a voice in him asks, what has person 1 done for me lately? Well, he just passed to me. That's what he did. And I can take all the money. So he's done that. He's made himself completely vulnerable to me. And so am I going to do that? Well, 2/3 are very reluctant to do that. So we realized that these Smith propositions had predictive force in these games. And also, because these propositions have a number of moving parts, you can ask whether, for example, Smith has this concept of self-command. And in fact, when we first start to become aware of our playmates not liking certain things, or certain of our actions, and being angered by other actions, and they respond by in beneficial ways to the good actions, and in hurtful ways toward the punishment ways toward the actions that are hurtful. That is defining the sort of rules that we are coming to live by. And so these do very well in these trust games. One place where there's slippage in the behavior is people don't always read the actions in the same way. There's some slipperiness there. Whereas, as far as I know, Smith doesn't discuss the question of how people might misread the actions of others. Or at least I can't recall it right currently. But here's a proposition. Smith says we are much more anxious that our friends share our enemies than that they share our other friends. Now, as far as I know, there's not been any experimental work on that, but think about that. really interesting. He says, in other words, we are, and if you think about, suppose you have a good friend and you're coming down very differently on a political candidate or on a topic in religion or something like that, then you may find it harder to maintain that friendship, you see, if you really see certain things very differently. So I think that's a proposition that I've not done anything with, but it's typical of the kind of propositions that come out of Adam Smith's way of thinking and this theory of society, which he, I think, develops so fully and very richly, and you can, many of the propositions you can really easily relate to your own situation and think about about friends and others. And of course, to me, this sheds some insight on why people trade. Now, Smith's early in The Wealth of Nations, he says that economies are driven from the bottom by the propensity of people to barter and exchange. And he says this is unique. He claims, he believes this is unique to our species, but he doesn't provide an explanation as to why that might be. But I think if you go back to his theory of moral sentiments and beneficence, proposition 1, you see it applies to two people simultaneously, because a trade, each is both benefiting the other and also rewarding the other at the same time. I think he didn't use that because he saw trade as likely motivated more by self-interest considerations than other regarding interests. But on the other hand, in the theory of moral sentiments, in later editions that he added, the original is 1759, the sixth and final edition was in 1790, shortly before he died. And there, in summarizing some of the earlier work, he says, who of all people should we be kind to? He says it's those who have been kind to us in the past. So he's bringing in, here he's deducing, you see, reciprocity from that beneficence proposition 1. Well, Anna, I think I'll give people a chance to ask questions.
May I be the first one then?
Sure, and the reason why I'm not using slides for this is that I think if I can just talk about Adam Smith and in a more discursive way, it's more likely to trigger questions and interests and comments on the part of the audience.
And you did not have slides, so.
Okay.
When you were talking about this desire to have common enemies between your friends rather than common friends, might Smith not perhaps say that it is the ability and the willingness of each individual to become an impartial spectator, to put themselves in somebody else's shoes, a way to bridge the gap between people that consider themselves to be on whatever margins enemies? Would that be Smith's solution to promote kindness?
You mean to try to understand why they're enemies and
what their motivations, and I think my reading of theory of moral sentiments was really that human beings had a desire to be lovely, is the word he uses, and that they had this innate ability to be what he calls the impartial spectator, observing from outside, and from then on deriving sentiments of empathy or sympathy for each other, and that we might today use these Smithian ideas when we are talking to people across the hallway who might disagree with us, that we want to take those Smithian insights perhaps.
Well, yes, he certainly saw rule violators as nevertheless feeling some remorse in having done something that was seriously hurtful toward others, maybe changed their lives in ways that created a lot of unhappiness. You see, to me, what he's trying to do is account for the fact that we're not all bad, and the societies are not all bad. There are, and of course, his notion of and you see, this is about voluntary action. You see, these rules that we follow are bottom-up rules of society. They're not imposed. They come out of the day-to-day ordinary people in antiquity, ordinary people like you, me, and our neighbors, and that maybe gets extended to strangers at fairs and celebrations and powwows and among American natives. These are celebration events is an opportunity to trade with people who have different kinds of goods, you see, than you have. Now, he didn't, you see, Smith he had a lot of data available because he knew history. He knew Roman and Greek history. He knew Roman and Greek literature, plays, stage plays, because he often refers to actors or actresses in roles conveying sympathetic fellow feeling, and he'll cite that as an example. And this human capacity for fellow feeling, mutual simultaneous fellow feeling. You see, he sees as underlying these rules that we follow and why they are so powerful. And he uses the word approbation, which means approval. An action is approved by someone, but approbation refers to a consensus approval by sort of the community. And his example of spontaneous fellow feeling is when an audience bursts into applause because of a performance on stage or a musical composition or something like that. So, and what I find neat about Adam Smith, he's very good at giving you examples like this to sort of illustrate what he's talking about. And people say today, well, he's really talking about empathy, not just sympathy, but I'm glad but he didn't have the word empathy. See, empathy is a 20th century word, really. And he didn't have that word, and I'm glad he didn't, because he spells out sort of what he means. Sympathetic, simultaneous sympathetic fellow feeling is underlying a lot of what he's talking about. Anyway, did that answer your question, or did I get too far off?
I appreciate it regardless. Oh, okay, so we have, I see 2 hands up. I saw her hand first. Would you mind standing up and speaking loudly? We don't have an extra microphone, so I apologize for that.
Sure. So acting in kindness is what like leads human nature to be free. Is that like the point of what Adam Smith is getting for like the foundations of freedom?
So she's asking if acting in kindness towards one another is the foundation of freedom in the view of Adam Smith?
Oh, yes. Yes, in fact, there's a passage in which he illustrates precisely your question. He says, your friend is coming to visit you. You are not in a mood to receive. It's not a good time. And if you were to greet him in your present mood, you come off in a very cold and disrespectful way. He says you don't do that. You manage to pull yourself together and you greet him with a reasonable modicum of good cheer. And he says if people didn't have this capacity for kindness and respect toward each other, at the bottom, what would happen to society? That he saw society, free societies, as being very much based on a lot of kindness and respect at the bottom among the citizens. That kindness and respect is very important, he saw, in the formation of free groups of people, and he saw it as scaling up to societies and nations. And he also, for example, he said that we're willing to run a fair amount of risk that a guilty person would go free in order to not in order to not commit the error of finding an innocent person guilty. He often talks about errors, you see, and these errors are not symmetric very often. If they're very asymmetric, he talks about that. And I think, you see, that helps us to see, and in fact, in our Constitution, you're innocent until proved guilty. The automatic presumption is that you're not guilty. You're innocent. So the presumption of innocence, you see, is a form in which that principle becomes part of our Constitution. And has his ideas of classical liberalism, you see, I think are very much embodied in Western constitutions, and they circled around and influenced a lot of other people. Now, I think he did not. He thought that people guilty of serious crimes felt remorse. Smith had no concept of the sociopath. You see, and that's, I think, something we know today that was not part of any of the data that Smith had available. And, well, Linda Mealer wrote a great article on sociopathology in, it's about 2003, I think. It's in Brain and Behavioral Sciences that I find is just really very good. She says that for one thing, it's a human universal. All populations will have about 5% sociopaths. Men more common than women. Prison populations contain about half or more sociopaths. Second and third time violators of the law will be 80%, 75 or 80%. So there's some kind of rough figures there, so that it's. And the thing is, the sociopath just doesn't get it. And it's, so this fellow feeling that begins early in our socialization, that he talks about when we first have playfellows. And he says he says, at that time we enter what Smith calls the great school of self-command. And no one can live hardly long enough not to continue to learn, you see, more about it, what it means to be in command of yourself. So his concept of self-command is kind of at the root of this bottom-up process. And I think that's actually what makes it powerful, and it helps to explain why the American experiment has survived a really lot of insults, including a civil war in which we were badly divided on slavery, and we didn't really. It wasn't until Brown versus Topeka, 1954, that we finally had at the Supreme Court level a full recognition of the rights of black people in our community, and that's how long it took. The Civil War, there was a slippage after that. First after the Civil War, where blacks were voting in the South, for heaven's sakes, they had suffrage, well, but then state laws started to reverse that. And we had a Supreme Court ruling in a completely different case. It was the Butcher's case of New Orleans, where the question of whether you were a citizen of the nation was equivalent, with the rights equivalent to your citizenship as in a state. And it ruled that those didn't have to be the same. There could be a distinction between your rights as a citizen of a state and your rights as a citizen of the country. And then that was used, you see, to stop the spreading of and the immediate giving of suffrage to blacks after the Civil War, and we didn't get that bone out of our throat for a very long time. So the Smith's principles, you see, I think we see them work in our Constitution. Constitution and in our society, but with a lot of fits and starts and backsliding, you see. But on balance, we have the rights of the individual defended in our Constitution have been gradually expanded to more and more people, even women and children.
Even us.
And that until, see, women didn't have the right to vote until 1919. That's a really long time.
Well, we are just about out of time, so I want to thank everyone for joining, and if you have any questions, I believe we're going to be hanging around for a few more minutes. I want to thank Vernon, and I'd like to ask you for a show of approbation for our speaker today. Thank you all for joining. If you need to sign in for one of your classes, it's